Hi everyone, it's Jen here, back in 2021 with a new video for you. This was actually one of my first orders of business this year because it's been a while since I put one out there, but finally here it is. Today's demo is about painting rocks. I know this is something many people struggle with, but I'm going to show you how I get my head around painting rocks using my tricolor method. There's quite a lot covered in this video, so please feel free to pause it whenever you need to, or come back and watch it again as many times as you like. If you're in my Paint Stunning Seascapes in Acrylics course, there will be a longer, more detailed version of this lesson available to you shortly. I'll let you know when that's ready to view. If you're not enrolled in the course and you'd like to find out more about it, I'll put a link in the notes below so you can go and check out the information page. Alright, I'm not going to waste any more time talking, let's get started.
Rocks, like waves, clouds, trees and all the other things in nature, can be a bit challenging to make look realistic, mostly because no two are exactly alike. My tricolour method of painting will make it easier because you only have to focus on 3 different tones for each step along the way. The painting demo will not be exactly to scale, mostly because I'm working on a very small canvas sheet and also trying to make the rocks as large as I can so you can see them clearly. My paints are Atelier brand in red gold, which is a warm yellow, Napthol Crimson and Ultramarine Blue. Yours might have different names depending on the brand, but as long as you have a red, yellow and blue along with white, it should work out just fine. Are you ready to dive in? First, I'll very quickly block in the background in a golden sand colour. I'm using one of my favourite colour combos for sand, which is mostly red gold and a small amount of Napthol Crimson and a tiny bit of Ultramarine Blue. White is also added to help achieve the correct tone. Starting at the bottom of the canvas, I'll apply the paint in sort of a crosshatch pattern to give the sand background a bit of texture. I make it paler as I move up the canvas. Okay, now to the rocks. Before I start with the painting, I'll roughly sketch in the shape of a couple of large rocks. Mostly when viewing rocks, only 2 or 3 sides would be visible, so I'm going to paint one rock with 3 sides and one with 2. So the first thing I'll do is to lay down a base colour of blue in 3 different tones, a shadow, a mid-tone and a highlight. The light source will be coming from the top right in this painting, so the deepest shadow tone will go on the left-hand side. I don't want this blue to be too vivid, so I've made a paint mix of mostly ultramarine blue with a bit of Napthol Crimson and some red gold added to dull it down a tiny bit. I've also added a little bit of white, saving my darkest tones for later. Once I've covered the left-hand face of the rock, I add some more white to the paint mix until I achieve a mid-tone, and then I'll use that to cover the middle rock face. Lastly, I add more white again to the mix to lighten it up further so I can paint the highlight tone to the right-hand rock face. Again, you want to leave some room to move here for even lighter tones on this rock face. So my blue is light, but not the lightest I could use. Now let's do the same for the second rock. I sketch in the shape with only 2 rock faces this time, and I paint these using the darkest and the lightest tones of my blue colour mix, eliminating the mid-tone. Just for fun, let's add another small rock in the foreground. I'll make this one a roundish shape for something different, and I'll keep it very simple. This time I'll start with a thin line of the shadow tone at the left. Then I'll cover the rest of the rock with the highlight tone and then blend the dark into the light to create the mid-tone. Continuing on with the small rock, I'd also like to see some variation of colour within that mid-tone so that the end result will look more like grey rather than blue. Therefore, I'll add a mix of red gold and white. If you don't have red gold, you can use any warm yellow such as yellow ochre. Just be sure to add enough white so that it looks the same tone. That is, neither lighter nor darker than the base blue that we've already applied. The dark tones and the mid-tones are now taken care of, so all I have to do with this little rock is to add an even lighter colour as the highlight tone. For this, I'll use a very light pink. I'm using Napthol Crimson, but you could use any red you like as long as you add lots of white so that it is paler than the colours we've already applied. Now you can see that not only have I used 3 different tones, I've also used 3 different colours. each of the primary colours in fact, blue, yellow and red. When you mix all three primary colours together, you get grey. Okay, so now let's take a look at the two-sided rock in the background. We can see that this rock looks somewhat three-dimensional, but so far each of those two rock faces still looks flat. So I'll add some contours to give each surface a rougher texture. Remembering that the light is coming from the top right, I'll first try to imagine which parts of this rock face would be getting hit by the most light, and I'll add a highlight colour there. The colour I'm going to use for the highlight is a very pale mix of red gold or yellow and white. I've decided to make a little fold in the rock here at the bottom left, so I'll add more or less a line of highlight colour along the edge where that rock starts to turn the corner. I'll also add a few bits of this colour to various places on the rock face where I want to show the parts that are jutting out the most. I'm just making them random, not trying to stick too closely to the reference photo. As I want the lightest part to be on the left, I will soften the edges of this colour out to the right using a technique known as scumbling. The part of the rock that is now around the corner will need a slightly darker highlight colour, so I'll add some more red gold to the mix and also tone it down a bit by adding a tiny bit of blue and red. On the darkest side of the rock, I'll add some more colour to the mix so that the tone is lighter than the base blue on this side, but darker than any other part of the rock. Again, I'll make the lightest parts at the left-hand edges of each contour in the rock and then soften to the right. Each rock face now has two tones, but we need to add a third, the shadow. Okay, so let's move back to the lightest rock face. You can see that we not only have two tones, but we also have two colours, blue and yellow. So which colour would I use to make the shadows? You guessed it, red. My red in this project is Napthol Crimson, so I'm going to start with that. I'm looking for quite a dark tone here, so I'll add some of red's complementary colour, green. You can use any green paint you like, but if you're using a limited palette like me, just add a bit of both your blue and your yellow, because blue and yellow make green, right? Now, the shadow should be applied at the opposite edge to the highlight. In this case, that means the right-hand edges of each contour. The way to figure out exactly where to place the shadows is easy. The darkest dark will be right next to the lightest light in order to give the maximum contrast. Then you can soften the shadows to the left, remembering to leave some of that mid-tone showing. Moving around the corner, I'll do exactly as I did previously and make my shadow colour slightly darker by adding more red and more green. Not too much though, the difference in angle of these two parts of the rock is not that great. Now when it comes to the darkest side of this rock, I'm going to shift gear a bit. I still want to have three different tones and three different colours on this rock face. However, this side is already much darker than the other two. I don't really want to make it darker still by adding a deeper colour. Instead, I'm going to use the red mix to add a lighter tone so that the base colour, blue, now becomes the darkest shadow colour. The yellow mix we added previously then becomes the mid-tone, and the red I'm going to add now will be the highlight colour. Use your own judgment here. If your rock face doesn't look as dark as mine, you might want to make the red mix deeper and use that as a shadow colour. It's the relationship between the tones that makes the difference. The placement of the colours is less important. Also, you don't have to limit yourself to just three tones if you don't want to. You could add an even lighter shade of blue to this rock face to show reflected light from surrounding surfaces. Now our rock has a rough looking surface, but we can go further still by adding all the cracks, nooks and crannies that you often see in these rocks. All you have to do is repeat the three-tone process. I'll quickly show you that now. To make these cracks visible though, you want the shadow tone to be even darker and the highlight tone to be even lighter than we used previously. That way we can get more contrast. To add the cracks, start with your darkest tone and draw a very fine line down the face of the rocks. I'm using a fairly even mix of all three primary colours, no white though. You could choose to use black paint from the tube if you wanted to, or make your own black. My favourite colour combos for making black are turquoise and crimson, or ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. To make this line even finer, you can remove some of the paint with a clean wet brush. Then, in a sort of a reverse procedure to what we did previously, add a highlight colour immediately to the top edge of each crack and blend it gently outwards. I'm using a very pale mix of pink for this. And of course you can use the same process to add some nooks and crannies to the darker side of the rock. I suggest you stand back and take a look at your work now to see if any final adjustments need to be made to the tonal relationships. Taking a photo, turning your work upside down, or looking at it in the mirror are all good ways to get a fresh perspective on your work. For example, the highlight tone I added to the dark side of the rock is not really light enough now for my liking because the paint has dried and it's gone darker. That's one thing to remember, acrylic paint always goes darker when it dries. I think I'll add some pinkish tones here this time to lighten it up a bit. I'll make the colour a little lighter than I think I need so that when the paint dries it'll be just right. I'd also like to soften the sharp ridge at the top of the rock where the two sides meet. The greater the difference in tones here, the sharper the edge of the rock is going to look. Therefore, I'll paint a thin line of this mid-tone colour down the ridge of the rock and soften it a bit with some scumbling. Okay, you still with me? There's a lot here, but let's keep going. Now on to the last rock. The last rock is basically the same technique, but I'll take a slightly different approach this time. I also want to dive a bit deeper into how to change the shape of the rock. The first difference you'll notice with this rock is that one side is facing more directly into the sunlight. That means I need to show more light and more contrast on that side. Before I start adding the highlights and shadows though, I'll add some variations in colour to this mid-tone. I've chosen to start with yellow. Because this is a mid-tone, I'll not add too much white to lift the tone, nor too much complementary colour to darken the tone. Instead, my red gold paint, or my yellow, has only a small amount of white added. When I get to the middle rock face, I'll add both some Napthol Crimson, or red, and some Ultramarine Blue, which of course makes purple, to tone down the colour a bit. Same again for the final rock face. Purple is added to the mix to tone down that yellow even more. Okay, we have blue and yellow tones on all three sides, so let's add some reds or pinks. Starting with the lightest rock face, I'll use a mix of crimson and white, making it a little lighter than the other tones so that when the paint dries it'll be just right. As before, I apply the paint and then roughly blend it into the surrounding area, making sure to leave some of the layers beneath visible. Onto the middle rock face and I tone down the pink with some green. Note that even though this colour is duller, it will still appear lighter than the other colours on the middle rock face, until the paint dries, that is. And finally, tone the pink down a bit more and add some to the darkest rock face. Now you can clearly see that each of these three rock faces are all the same tone, despite the fact that there are three different colours in each one. Now I don't really like the shape of this rock. It looks too much like a prism to me, so let's see what we can do about that. I'm going to add a little horizontal shelf here on the left hand side, a shelf that's being hit by direct sunlight. Therefore I'll use a very light tone and I've chosen to make it blue, so that is the ultramarine blue with lots of white. I also want the top edge of the rock to be not too level, so I will extend this front rock face a little to the left from about halfway along this ridge to the bottom where it joins the middle rock face. Then I'll just keep placing some of this very light colour on any area where I want to see a piece of rock that's jutting out a bit. You can even extend this colour beyond the bottom edge of the rock so that the line along the sand there doesn't appear too straight. Now that I've shifted the edge at the top though, I also need to make adjustments to the shadow side of the rock. Notice that the greater the contrast here, the sharper the top ridge will look. Next, I'll add some cracks, nooks and crannies to the front of the rock face, just as we did with the previous rock. The thing to remember here though is that because this side is facing the direct sunlight, you want maximum contrast between the lights and darks. That's why I'm using a colour mix of mostly red and blue with just a small amount of the yellow, and no white this time. You can see that it's almost black. Remember to apply your darkest darks directly adjacent to the lightest lights and then gently blend into the surrounding area. You can continue to play around with it here, adding lines and softening edges until you're happy with the results. Of course, I'll need to also add a shadow beneath these areas of highlight that we extended beyond the bottom edge of the rock. I'll start with the darkest tone and then add the mid-tone later. Always 3 tones, remember? To accentuate these cracks, simply add more highlights directly adjacent to the dark lines. To make your grey appear more vibrant, you can add back some more of this yellow tone to balance out the other colours. Now don't forget to add some nooks and crannies to the other 2 rock faces using shadows and highlights. Just remember that all your tones are relative to each other. If you're unsure if you have the tone correct, just try a little on the canvas and then let it dry before moving forward. By using all 3 colours, they'll balance each other out and make your rock appear grey without appearing dull. Well, the rocks look great now, but there's still one problem. They look like they're floating in the air. Making your rocks appear grounded, though, is a very simple 2-step process, and I'll quickly show you that before I end this video. First, you need to alter the shape at the bottom of the rock where it meets the sand. I do this by working in the negative space, that is, altering the area around the rock rather than the rock itself. On the sunlit side, you can use the same colour mix that we used right back in the beginning to create the sand background. That was, if you remember, red gold with a small amount of Napthol Crimson and Ultramarine Blue added, with some white to achieve the correct tone. Don't forget to make it a little lighter than the surrounding sand so that when the paint dries it will match perfectly. Focus on the nooks and crannies and make an indentation wherever you see one. Working with horizontal strokes will give the base of a rock a more natural look. On the shadow side, you can do exactly the same thing, however, it will need to be a shadow colour this time on the sand. That means, of course, toning down that sand colour with some more red and some blue. Well, that's where I'm going to leave it with the rocks demonstration. I could go on and on with more suggestions such as how to get the perspective correct and the scale, or how to paint rocks in water, etc, etc. But I think we've covered a lot already today. I don't want to overwhelm you with information overload. I have been guilty of that on more than one occasion. I always just want to share every thought that's going through my head when I'm painting, because I believe if you understand the reasoning behind the techniques, it makes it a whole lot easier to retain the knowledge. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If so, please let me know by liking, commenting and sharing. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the Blue Beach House Art channel so you will be the first to know when the next video becomes available. If you have any questions, please contact me or visit my website bluebeachhouseart.com. I'll see you next time.